October 15, 1942. Wright-Patterson Field, Ohio. The autumn wind whistled across the sprawling aircraft testing facility as maintenance crews worked through another 16-hour shift, preparing the latest batch of B-17 Flying Fortress bombers for their journey across the Atlantic. In a cluttered storage room beneath Hangar 7, 63-year-old Stanley Kowalski pushed his mop bucket across the polished concrete floor, completely unaware that the peculiar industrial wax he had been using for the past 3 months would soon change the course of aerial warfare forever. The engineers and test pilots rushing past him that morning believed they understood every aspect of their magnificent flying machines, confident that American industrial might and engineering excellence would eventually overwhelm the German forces through sheer numbers and superior production capacity. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What none of them could have imagined was that the key to making their bombers virtually invisible to enemy detection systems was already sitting in a janitor's supply closet, dismissed as worthless industrial surplus and destined for disposal at the end of the month. Stanley had worked at Wright-Patterson for nearly 2 decades, starting as a young immigrant from Poland who spoke broken English and knew nothing about airplanes. By 1942, he had become an institution at the base, arriving each morning at 4:30 to begin his rounds through the testing facilities, hangars, and administrative buildings. His weathered hands had cleaned every surface of the most advanced aircraft in the world, and his keen eyes had noticed details that escaped the attention of engineers with multiple university degrees. 3 months earlier, the base supply department had received a shipment of experimental floor wax from Carnoba Industries in Detroit. The manufacturer had developed this particular formulation for use in radio equipment factories, claiming it would prevent static buildup on sensitive electronic components. However, initial tests at several civilian facilities had proven disappointing. The wax left surfaces with an unusual matte finish that plant managers found unattractive, and it seemed to absorb rather than reflect light in strange ways. Carnoba Industries had offered the remaining 400 gallons to the military at 75% below cost, hoping to recoup their losses on what company executives privately called their biggest product development failure of the year. Lieutenant Colonel James Morrison, the base procurement officer, had accepted the wax primarily because it was cheap and the base needed floor cleaning supplies. He assigned the entire shipment to Stanley's maintenance department with instructions to use it up as quickly as possible. What Morrison and the supply department did not realize was that this experimental wax contained a unique blend of carbon-based compounds and metallic particles that had been specifically engineered to absorb electromagnetic radiation in the radio frequency spectrum. Stanley had been using the new wax for 12 weeks when he first noticed something peculiar. While cleaning the floors of the radar testing laboratory in Building 43, he observed that the German radar equipment captured during the North African campaign seemed to function differently when he worked in the room. The technicians operating the equipment frequently complained that their readings became inconsistent and unreliable whenever Stanley was performing his maintenance duties. Initially, everyone assumed this was merely coincidence or perhaps electrical interference from his floor polisher. Technical Sergeant Robert Chen, a radar specialist with a degree in electrical engineering from Massachusetts Institute of Technology, had been growing increasingly frustrated with the captured German radar system. The Freya early warning radar, which the German forces had used to detect incoming Allied aircraft over the English Channel, worked perfectly most of the time. However, on certain days, particularly when the laboratory floors had been recently cleaned, the system would inexplicably lose target acquisition or display erratic readings. On November 3rd, Chen decided to conduct a systematic investigation. He arranged for Stanley to clean the laboratory floor while the radar system was active and targeting a B-17 bomber positioned on the runway approximately 2 miles away. The results were extraordinary. Within 30 minutes of Stanley beginning his floor cleaning routine, the radar return from the stationary bomber began to fade dramatically. By the time Stanley had finished waxing the floor, the radar system could barely detect the aircraft at all. Chen immediately contacted Captain David Walsh, the chief engineer for radar development at Wright-Patterson. Walsh, A former Bell Laboratories scientist who had worked on some of the earliest American radar projects was initially skeptical of Chen's report. The idea that floor wax could interfere with radar detection seemed scientifically implausible. However, Walsh agreed to witness a demonstration the following morning. The test on November 4th exceeded everyone's expectations. With the laboratory floor freshly waxed, the German radar system completely lost track of not one, but 3 B-17 bombers positioned at varying distances from the facility. The aircraft, which should have appeared as bright blips on the radar screen, were virtually invisible to the German detection equipment. Walsh immediately ordered additional tests using American radar systems, and the results were consistently similar. The waxed floor was somehow absorbing or deflecting the radar signals in ways that created a detection blind spot. Dr. Margaret Fieldstone, a chemist from the National Bureau of Standards who had been consulting with the military on materials research, was called in to analyze the mysterious floor wax. Her initial chemical analysis revealed the presence of iron carbonyl particles suspended in a carnauba wax base, along with traces of graphite and other carbon-based compounds. More importantly, she discovered that when applied to a surface and allowed to cure, these materials created a matrix that could absorb electromagnetic radiation across a broad spectrum of frequencies, including those used by both German and American radar systems. The implications were staggering. If this wax could be applied to aircraft surfaces, it might be possible to make American bombers significantly more difficult for German radar operators to detect. The potential strategic advantage was enormous, considering that German radar networks had been causing substantial losses among Allied bombing missions over occupied Europe. However, transforming a janitor's cleaning supply into a viable military technology presented numerous challenges. The wax, as originally formulated, was designed for indoor floor surfaces, not for the extreme conditions faced by aircraft operating at altitudes of 25,000 feet in temperatures that could reach 40 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. Additionally, the application process had to be refined to ensure uniform coverage and durability under combat conditions. Major General Curtis Mills, commander of the Wright-Patterson testing facility, authorized a classified research program codenamed Project Invisible Fortress. The program brought together materials, scientists, aeronautical engineers, radar specialists, and manufacturing experts to develop a practical application system for what they had begun calling the Kowalski formula, in honor of the janitor whose careful observations had led to the discovery. Stanley found himself at the center of an unprecedented military research effort. Despite having no formal scientific training, his practical knowledge of how the wax behaved under different conditions proved invaluable to the research team. He could predict how long the material would take to cure under various temperature and humidity conditions, how many coats would be required for optimal effectiveness, and which application techniques would provide the most uniform coverage. The first major breakthrough came in December 1942, when Dr. Fieldstone's team successfully modified the original formula to withstand the extreme conditions of high-altitude flight. By adjusting the ratio of carbon particles to wax base and adding specialized binding agents, they created a coating that maintained its radar-absorbing properties at altitudes up to 30,000 feet, while remaining flexible enough to expand and contract with the aircraft's aluminum skin. Captain Frank Rodriguez, a test pilot with over 2,000 hours in B-17 aircraft, was selected to fly the first missions with the experimental coating. Rodriguez, whose family had emigrated from Mexico when he was 12 years old, had earned his pilot's wings at Randolph Field in Texas and had already completed 15 bombing missions over occupied Europe before being assigned to the Wright-Patterson testing program. The initial flight tests in January 1943 were conducted over Lake Erie, with multiple radar stations tracking Rodriguez's aircraft from various angles and distances. The results exceeded all expectations, with the experimental coating applied to approximately 60% of the aircraft's surface. The B-17's radar signature was reduced by more than 80% compared to untreated aircraft. To German radar operators, the bomber would appear to be little more than a flock of birds or atmospheric interference. However, the coating process presented significant logistical challenges. Each B-17 bomber required approximately 40 gallons of the specialized wax mixture, and the application process took skilled technicians nearly 18 hours to complete properly. The aircraft had to be thoroughly cleaned, primed with a specialized base coat, and then painted with multiple layers of the radar-absorbing material using precise application techniques that Stanley had developed through months of trial and error. Production limitations meant that only a small number of bombers could be treated with the experimental coating initially. Priority was given to aircraft assigned to the most dangerous missions, particularly those targeting heavily defended German industrial centers, where radar-directed anti-aircraft defenses were most sophisticated. Lieutenant William Thompson, a navigator on one of the first operationally coated B-17 bombers, described his experience during a mission over the Ruhr Valley industrial region in February 1943. Thompson, a former mathematics teacher from Iowa who had joined the Army Air Forces immediately after Pearl Harbor, noticed that German searchlights seemed unable to locate their aircraft despite clear weather conditions and bright moonlight. During the mission briefing, Thompson and his crewmates had been told only that their aircraft had been equipped with experimental equipment designed to improve their survival chances. They were not informed about the nature of the coating or its radar-absorbing properties, as the entire program remained classified at the highest levels. What Thompson observed during the mission was that German defensive responses seemed delayed and poorly coordinated compared to previous flights over the same target area. The German radar operators, meanwhile, were reporting increasingly frequent malfunctions and system failures. Obergefreiter Hans Möller, a radar technician stationed near Cologne, noted in his official reports that Allied aircraft were appearing and disappearing from their screens in ways that defied explanation. Möller, who had been trained on the latest German radar equipment at the technical school in Munich, suspected that the Allies had developed some form of electronic jamming system, but the interference patterns did not match any known jamming techniques. What Möller and his colleagues could not understand was that certain Allied aircraft were not being jammed at all, but were instead absorbing their radar signals rather than reflecting them back to the receiving stations. The radar waves were hitting the aircraft and being absorbed by the specialized coating, leaving virtually no electromagnetic signature for the German operators to detect. Colonel Heinrich Weber, the commanding officer of the German radar defense network in the Rhine Valley, became increasingly concerned about the apparent deterioration in his unit's detection capabilities. Weber, a career officer who had served in the German army since 1928, was known for his meticulous attention to detail and his ability to maintain complex technical equipment under difficult conditions. When his most experienced operators began reporting systematic failures in target acquisition, Weber ordered a comprehensive review of all radar installations under his command. The German investigation found that the radar equipment was functioning perfectly according to all technical specifications. The transmitters were operating at full power, the receivers were properly calibrated, and the antenna systems were correctly aligned. However, statistical analysis of detection reports revealed that Allied aircraft losses over Weber's sector had decreased significantly during the past 6 weeks, while the number of successful Allied bombing missions had increased correspondingly. Weber forwarded his findings to higher headquarters with a recommendation that German scientists investigate the possibility that the Allies had developed a new form of stealth technology. However, German military leadership, focused on more immediate tactical concerns, did not prioritize research into what they assumed was a temporary operational anomaly. By March 1943, the Americans had perfected their coating application process sufficiently to begin treating larger numbers of aircraft. The specialized wax formula had been modified to reduce application time to 8 hours per bomber, and production had increased to the point where 20 aircraft per week could be processed at Wright-Patterson Field. Additional coating facilities were established at bases in England, allowing bombers already stationed in Europe to be treated without returning to the United States. Technical Sergeant Maria Santos, a chemical engineer who had been recruited from the DuPont Corporation to oversee the European coating operations, established the first overseas facility at an airfield in eastern England. Santos, whose expertise in industrial coating processes had made her one of the few women assigned to classified aircraft modification programs, trained British and American technicians in the precise application techniques that Stanley Kowalski had developed. The effectiveness of the coating became apparent during major bombing campaigns in the spring of 1943. Missions involving coated aircraft experienced significantly lower loss rates compared to those using conventional bombers. More importantly, the coated aircraft were able to penetrate German airspace with much less advance warning, allowing them to reach their targets before German fighter aircraft could be positioned to intercept them. Staff Sergeant Joseph Martinez, a gunner on one of the coated B-17 bombers, wrote to his wife in New Mexico that their recent missions had been remarkably quiet compared to earlier flights. Martinez, who had previously flown 12 combat missions and had grown accustomed to intense German defensive responses, noted that German fighter aircraft seemed to have difficulty locating their formation even in broad daylight. What Martinez did not realize was that the radar-absorbing coating was working in conjunction with other factors to make his aircraft extraordinarily difficult to detect and track. German ground-based radar operators were having trouble maintaining consistent contact with the aircraft, which meant that fighter controllers could not provide accurate guidance to intercepting aircraft. By the time German pilots made visual contact with the American bombers, the bombing runs were often already completed. The strategic impact of the coating program extended beyond individual mission success rates. German military planners, faced with increasingly unpredictable Allied bombing patterns, were forced to disperse their defensive resources across much wider areas. Fighter aircraft that had previously been concentrated near the most likely target areas now had to be stationed at airfields throughout occupied Europe, reducing the overall effectiveness of German air defenses. Dr. Fieldstone's continued research revealed additional benefits of the coating beyond radar absorption. The material also reduced the infrared signature of aircraft, making them more difficult to detect, using heat-seeking equipment that German forces had begun deploying in limited numbers. Furthermore, the coating provided modest protection against corrosion and weather damage, potentially extending the operational life of treated aircraft. Stanley Kowalski, meanwhile, had become something of a celebrity among the technical personnel at Wright-Patterson Field. Despite receiving offers to transfer to higher-paying positions in the research department, Stanley chose to continue his work as a maintenance supervisor, training other janitors and technicians in the proper handling and application of the specialized coating materials. His practical wisdom and attention to detail had become essential elements of the coating program's success. By summer 1943, the coating program had treated over 400 B-17 bombers, representing approximately 15% of the total American heavy bomber force in Europe. The cumulative impact on German defensive capabilities was becoming apparent to Allied intelligence analysts, who noted significant reductions in the accuracy and timeliness of German responses to bombing missions. Major Elizabeth Crawford, an intelligence analyst with the 8th Air Force headquarters in England, documented the changing patterns of German defensive behavior in her classified reports to Washington. Crawford, who had studied German military tactics at the War Department's intelligence school, observed that German radar-directed anti-aircraft fire had become noticeably less accurate over the past 4 months, particularly against formations that included coated aircraft. The German military leadership, still unaware of the true nature of the Allied technological advantage, began implementing increasingly desperate measures to improve their detection capabilities. Additional radar stations were constructed throughout occupied Europe, existing equipment was upgraded with more powerful transmitters, and radar operators were retrained using new detection procedures. However, none of these measures significantly improved their ability to track aircraft treated with the American coating. Oberst Friedrich Richter, the chief technical officer for German air defense systems, submitted a detailed report to his superiors in August 1943, acknowledging that Allied aircraft appeared to have gained a significant technological advantage in the ongoing electronic warfare battle. Richter, whose engineering team had developed some of the most advanced radar systems in the German military, recommended immediate research into countermeasures, but German scientific resources were increasingly focused on other priority programs. The success of the coating program began to influence American strategic planning for the remainder of the war. General Carl Spaatz, commanding general of United States Strategic Air Forces in Europe, authorized an expansion of bombing targets to include more heavily defended objectives that had previously been considered too dangerous for daylight operations. The reduced loss rates among coated aircraft made these missions tactically feasible for the first time. Lieutenant Colonel Patricia Williams, a mission planning officer at Spaatz's headquarters, noted in her operational assessments that coated aircraft were consistently achieving higher target accuracy rates compared to conventional bombers. Williams attributed this improvement to the reduced German defensive pressure that allowed bomber crews to focus more effectively on their primary objectives rather than defensive maneuvering. As 1943 progressed into 1944, the coating program expanded to include other aircraft types beyond the B-17. Modified versions of the radar-absorbing material were successfully applied to P-51 Mustang fighters, providing escort aircraft with enhanced survivability during long-range missions deep into German-occupied territory. Captain Robert Chen, the radar specialist whose initial investigations had led to the coating's development, was promoted to major and assigned to lead research into even more advanced stealth technologies. Chen's team began experimenting with radar-absorbing materials that could be integrated into aircraft manufacturing processes rather than applied as aftermarket coatings. The long-term impact of Stanley Kowalski's accidental discovery extended far beyond the immediate tactical advantages gained during World War II. The fundamental principles of radar absorption and electromagnetic signature reduction discovered through the floor wax research became the foundation for decades of subsequent military stealth technology development. Dr. Fieldstone's research team expanded to include scientists from universities and corporations across the United States, continued refining radar-absorbing materials throughout the remainder of the war. Their work led to the development of specialized paints, fabrics, and composite materials that would eventually be incorporated into military aircraft, ships, and ground vehicles for generations to come. Stanley Kowalski retired from Wright-Patterson Field in 1946 at the age of 67, having received a civilian commendation for his contributions to the war effort. He returned to his modest home in Dayton, Ohio, where he spent his remaining years tending a small garden and occasionally consulting with materials engineers who sought his practical insights into coating application techniques. The classified nature of the coating program meant that Stanley's contributions remained largely unknown to the general public for decades after the war. However, among the scientific and military communities involved in stealth technology development, his name became synonymous with the kind of careful observation and practical wisdom that can transform accidental discoveries into revolutionary technological advances. The German military never fully understood the nature of the Allied advantage in radar evasion during World War II. Post-war interrogations of German radar operators and technical personnel revealed that they had attributed the declining effectiveness of their detection systems to Allied electronic jamming, equipment failures, and operator fatigue, rather than to fundamental advances in aircraft stealth technology. Colonel Weber, the German radar defense commander who had first documented the anomalous detection patterns, was captured by Allied forces in April 1945. During his interrogation, Weber expressed amazement when American intelligence officers explained the true nature of the radar-absorbing coating program. He had spent the final 2 years of the war implementing increasingly complex defensive measures to counter what he believed was sophisticated electronic warfare equipment, never suspecting that the solution was as simple as a specialized floor wax applied to aircraft surfaces. The floor wax discovery demonstrated how technological breakthroughs could emerge from the most unexpected sources during wartime. The combination of Stanley's practical experience, Dr. Fieldstone's scientific expertise, and the military's willingness to pursue unconventional research approaches had created a capability that provided significant strategic advantages with relatively modest resource investments. Modern stealth aircraft continue to employ radar-absorbing materials that trace their conceptual origins to the experimental floor wax discovered at Wright-Patterson Field in 1942. The fundamental principle of using specialized materials to absorb rather than reflect electromagnetic radiation remains a cornerstone of military stealth technology more than 8 decades after Stanley Kowalski first noticed that his floor wax seemed to interfere with radar equipment. The story of the invisible bombers illustrates how individual observation and scientific curiosity could combine to produce innovations that influenced the outcome of global conflicts. Stanley's willingness to report unusual phenomena, combined with the military's commitment to investigating even the most unlikely possibilities, created opportunities for technological advances that might never have emerged through conventional research approaches. The legacy of Project Invisible Fortress extends beyond its immediate military applications to encompass broader lessons about innovation, collaboration, and the importance of maintaining open minds when confronting complex technical challenges. The program demonstrated that breakthrough technologies could emerge from the intersection of practical experience and scientific research, particularly when supported by institutional willingness to explore unconventional approaches. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.